Hey guys, okay, let's take a look at now chapter 9, your muscular chapter. I'm going to be honest with you guys, in your all's textbook, the muscular system goes into a lot of detail, and since we so heavily covered the skeletal system this week, I really chopped this one up for you guys. I'm going to be pretty short and sweet with this one. I want you guys to really focus on the bones and the skeletal system this week. I think if we went over all the muscles and all the detail that your textbook goes into for the muscular system, I think you guys would be overwhelmed, and I don't want to do that to you guys. So I've already cut up your PowerPoint. So if you guys are skimming through your textbook and you see how it's going into all the cells of muscle tissue and going into the myofibrils and looking at the details of all the layers of the muscle, even breaking down all the muscle fibers, I want you guys to know that I cut that out. It does go into naming of all the muscles, and I left that on your PowerPoint, but I'm not going to test you guys on that. I left it on there only because I think it's interesting. I think it's good to be familiar with some of the muscles, but I don't test you on it because I'm going to focus on the bones as far as the naming. So let's take a look at the PowerPoint. Let me show you guys what I want you guys to be familiar with. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you guys. I'm going to open up the Chapter 9 PowerPoint here, and let's start from the beginning, and I'll show you guys what you guys need to know. So here in this chapter, we are going to, and this is one of the biggest things I want you guys to know from this chapter, are the 3 different types of muscle tissue. We briefly talked about that in week 1 when we talked about knowing the difference between skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. If you guys remember that, we talked about that when we looked at the different types of tissues. So that hopefully is familiar to you all. We're going to touch on that again, and I'm going to remind you guys where we find that. I actually went ahead and cut this out already, the structure of a whole muscle and the structure of a single muscle fiber. I went ahead and took that out so you guys can not worry about that at all. We are going to look briefly at the relationship between skeletal muscles and nerves. So we'll focus more on nerves next week. So we're going to kind of see a brief introduction into the nervous system today when we talk about its relationship to the skeletal muscle. So I'll show you guys what I mean by that. So real short and sweet with that too. Okay. So let me show you guys this. So just a reminder, we have 3 different types of muscle tissue. We have skeletal muscle. I want you guys to know where we find skeletal muscle. And hopefully guys, you can tell by the name, the skeletal muscle is found on the skeleton. It is the muscle that's responsible for moving our bones. Every muscle in our entire body is designed to contract, and the purpose of contraction is to produce some type of movement, whether it be of our bones or, moving food through our digestive system, moving blood through our arteries, or moving blood through the heart. The purpose of muscular tissue is to provide movement for our body. And so the skeletal muscle, the contraction of the skeletal muscle, is going to provide movement for our bones. So me waving my hand around right now is because my skeletal muscle is in action. It's the muscle movement that we see the most of because we have so much as far as our bones are concerned. Smooth muscle, however, we find that in a lot of different places in our body as well. If you guys remember, smooth muscle is found in a lot of our organs, especially hollow organs that are responsible for transportation of things, such as our arteries. Our arteries and our veins are also going to be lined with smooth muscle because blood needs to be sent through our arteries and our veins. So that lining of smooth muscle around those particular blood vessels, when we see a slight contraction, with that, it's going to push blood forward with that movement. Same thing with our digestion. When we swallow food, yes, we appreciate gravity. Gravity is going to help to take that food down through our esophagus and into our stomach. But with the aid of smooth muscle, as soon as we swallow, there's going to be smooth muscle that will contract and help to push that food down the esophagus and into the stomach. And we'll see that again in digestion, but also throughout the rest of our digestive tract. The stomach has some smooth muscle in it so that it can be pushed out as it continues through digestion. The next part after the stomach is what's called the small intestine. And the small intestine is the one in our body, since we haven't talked about the digestive system yet. The small intestines are the ones that kind of go up, over, around, just a big long tube that's kind of squished up in our abdomen there. So in order for that food to move up, down, and around, we're going to be dependent on smooth muscle. So as a refresher, that's where we find that smooth muscle. And cardiac muscle, one and only place it's found in our body is in our heart. The purpose of our heart contractions, not only is it what's keeping us alive, but the reason it's keeping us alive is because it's delivering oxygen to all of our tissues in our body. When we talk about blood in week 4, we'll talk about how blood is needed everywhere in our entire body, and that is because we need oxygen. We know that when we breathe, we are kept alive, and we know that. And the purpose of that breathing, though, is to pick up oxygen, and oxygen is needed by all of our tissues. My big toe needs oxygen. My heart needs oxygen. My brain needs oxygen, and blood is going to be what gets it there. And so our heart is kind of the grand central station of that it's going to be what all that blood has to go through in order it to be pumped to where it needs to go. So our heart is going to make sure that that happens. So picture on the next slide is going to remind us of where we find these different muscles. So our skeletal muscle, there's what it looks like, as far as its appearance underneath a microscope. It's what's called striated, which means it has those little striations in it. Not that you guys need to know that, but it is a voluntary muscle movement. As again, the movement of my hand is something that I'm voluntarily choosing to do. It is the only voluntary muscle in our body, whereas smooth muscle and cardiac muscle is involuntary because I'm not thinking about it. I'm not choosing to do those movements. My body's doing that for me. So in the next picture, you guys can see at the stomach and the first part of the small intestine there. So it says organs or viscera, our stomach. There you can see what it looks like underneath a microscope. It is very smooth looking, as you can see. So as the name implies, it is not striated. It doesn't have those little striations in it. And it is, again, involuntary. And then there's our cardiac muscle. It is striated like skeletal muscle is, a little bit of a different look, but you can see that it is only located in our heart. And again, it is also involuntary because I'm not sitting there telling my heart when to beat and when not to beat. Instead, my heart does it for me. So I do want you guys to be familiar with those 3 types of muscle tissue. A couple different connective tissue terms I want you guys to be familiar with in this chapter. Fascia. Fascia is a connective tissue that actually connects. It's a membrane that goes all the way around our muscle tissue, and it connects it's underneath our skin, and it's what connects the skin to the muscle. There's actually different layers of that fascia within the muscle tissue. If you've, again, look through your textbook at all, it may get into the epimysium and the paramecium, and you guys don't need to worry about that. Those are different connective tissue membranes that actually surround the groups of muscle fibers within our muscle tissue. So as long as you know fascia is the connective tissue membrane that surrounds our muscle, and again, what connects our skin to our muscle, then that's all you need to know about that. Whereas a tendon, I briefly mentioned this in the previous chapter when we were discussing ligaments. A ligament is a connective tissue in our skeletal system that connects our bones to other bones. Whereas a tendon is responsible for connecting muscles to bones. The reason why that skeletal muscle can work and why I can move my arm around like this is because that muscle is connected to my bone because of a tendon. So tendons are there for that purpose, to help connect. And so that picture is showing us the connection. And we're going to look at this picture again when we start talking about some other terms. But you can see that tendon is what's responsible for that there. There you can see that connective tissue. So as I just mentioned, so muscles form attachments by tendons. Tendons are going to attach muscle to bone, but sometimes muscles will just directly attach to bone or other surrounding soft tissues as well. But that's, again, no, I would definitely be familiar with that term tendon to know what that is. So to briefly talk to you guys about somatic motor neuron. Again, I mentioned when we were talking about the muscle tissue that our skeletal muscle tissue was the only voluntary muscle tissue. It is what we'll talk about when we get into our nervous system chapter next class or next week. I'll talk to you guys about the difference between our somatic nervous system, which is our voluntary movements, controlled by nerves, but also our what's called autonomic nervous system, which are the automatic functions. So our smooth muscle and our cardiac, those two muscles respond on their own without me having to tell it to do something. So our skeletal muscle is part of that, it's controlled by our somatic nerve division. So skeletal muscle contraction only takes place, and that's what that means. It only takes place when it is first stimulated by a nerve. There's something that tells it how to work, what to do. And so again, it's me telling it, but I have, there's a part in my brain that says, hey, I want to move my arm right now. There's a nerve that's going to stimulate that skeletal muscle and tell my arm to move the way that I want it to. So somatic motor nerve is going to be what supplies that skeletal muscle. So, we can associate those two terms really together, that the term somatic is the division of the nervous system that controls our skeletal muscle. It emerges from the spinal cord and it travels to that skeletal muscle, and it's going to then connect. So it shows that connection here. So here's the spinal cord coming out of our brain right there. And again, we're going to see this in a little bit more detail next class. So we'll talk a little bit more so about it then. But just to kind of give you, like I said, that brief introduction, that term somatic is the nervous system that controls our skeletal muscle. So there you can see that connection to the skeletal muscle fibers there. And I wouldn't worry too much about this. This is interesting. I think it's good to see, but I'm not going to test you guys on this. I'll be honest with you guys here. But what this shows us, and this is just kind of going to introduce us to what we'll talk about next class too. This is the end of that somatic nerve that we were talking about. So this was what's called the neuromuscular junction. So that name implies exactly what this is. The neuromuscular means it's where the nerve meets the muscle. At this space, what happens is, and like I said, we'll see this next week, but when a message is sent from one nerve to another, or in this case, from the nerve to the muscle, it's passed on through what's called neurotransmitters, which is simply just a chemical that's going to allow for that process to take place. So there's a small little space between the motor neuron and that muscle, and that is where that neurotransmitter, again, it's a chemical, ACH is acetylcholine, that's going to be that neurotransmitter that will send that signal to our muscle. So as it mentions there, that's the site of that action and that activation of that muscle membrane. So it shows, what's taking place here, and it's pushing that through, and it's going to then send a signal to the muscles. So again, I'm not going to test you guys on this and go into great detail about it. The book goes into a little bit more detail, but I think it's interesting to just know that, again, the skeletal muscle is controlled by our nerves, and those nerves are actually sending a signal to our muscles, specifically through a chemical called a neurotransmitter. So the next part that we'll get into we're going to look at a couple different terms in this section. You can see I've already kind of cut up that, we're already into the next section, so we've really cut up the PowerPoint here quite a bit. So I want you guys to take a look at, we're not going to get into too much detail with these, but I do want to show you guys the difference between what's called twitch and tetanus. We're going to look at the sources. Actually, I think I cut that out, so we're going to skip over that, and then we'll kind of finish up with just looking at some of our common muscles. But like I said, I'm not going to test you guys on all the different names. I just wanted to be kind of short and sweet with our muscular chapter here. So our muscle responses, a couple different terms I want you guys to know about these different muscle responses. Some you might already be familiar with. So a twitch is a single muscle response in which a muscle will contract and then fully relax. So it's kind of a quick, sometimes you get a muscle twitch and you may feel that, where it's contracting and relaxing. And sometimes it happens repeatedly, but that contraction and then that full relaxation is called a twitch, where it just contract, relax, and that's it. Whereas then tetanus, so not to be confused with the disease tetanus, this is actually a good thing. A lot of times we use the same term for different things, but tetanus is actually sustained muscle contraction that's caused by repeated stimulation. So this is actually really important for our posture, that when we're trying to sit up straight, and there's actually a repeated muscle contraction that's causing that constant stimulation, and we're stimulating it by trying to maintain that posture. Tonus is very, very similar. This is a normal continuous state of partial muscle contraction, and this is what's responsible for our muscle tone. So our tone that we have is, again, as that name implies there, that tonus is just a continuous muscle contraction. Our muscles are really kind of always contracting, and that's why, because we're always either sitting up, even if we're sitting down, you know, we're maintaining that muscle tone, and so there's a partial muscle contraction with that tone. So that's what those terms mean. I would be familiar with those as well. A couple other different terms I want you guys to be familiar with, and this is a great example. I always, when I was showing you guys flexion, we were talking about muscle movements in the previous chapter, kind of introducing into our muscle chapter here. That flexion that I was showing you guys, it's always a great example to show you the, you know, the radius and the ulna moving up towards the humerus. Whereas here, so there's specific muscles that are involved in that process, and just to kind of again, short and sweet with it, the muscle on top is our biceps, and then the muscle on the bottom is our tricep. So in these terms, I want you guys to be familiar with, not necessarily the bicep and the tricep, but I want you guys to know these different ones. So the origin and the insertion. In that process of that muscle movement of flexion, the origin of the muscle is the point of attachment where there is no movement taking place. It's not attached, it's attached to the non-mover, if that makes sense. So you can see here the origin is up here at the top, because what's going to happen is the lower arm is going to be the part of the body that's moving, whereas up here at the shoulder, we're not doing any movement right here. So the origin, kind of think of the origin as the original point. That's what's going to stand steady and not move. Whereas the insertion of that muscle is attached to the one that's moving. It's attached to it, so that's the attachment point of the, of the moving muscle. So, or of the body part that's moving. So here you can see that insertion is attached down there to the radius, because when we pull that muscle up, that's what's moving. So the insertion, think about it that way. Origin attached to the non-mover, insertion is attached to the mover. Okay, so as far as the bones are concerned. Whereas the prime mover itself, so the muscle, so these two are talking about the origin, insertion, are talking about the attachments to the bones. As far as origin is attached to the non-moving bone, or insertion is attached to the moving bone. The prime mover is referencing the specific muscle that's causing this muscle movement that we're talking about. So in this example, we're talking about the flexion of, this, again, the radius and the ulna being brought up to the humerus. So my origin is at the shoulder and my insertion is down at the elbow. But my prime mover in this instance is actually the bicep. Remember, and I think this was just kind of a brief thing I mentioned to you guys in the last chapter, but muscles, when they contract, they can only pull. So what happens in this example, the bicep is the prime mover, because it's going to be what's pulling on that lower arm. But in the muscle movement of extension, now we have a different situation taking place. Now the tricep is going to become the prime mover, because what's going to happen is my bicep will relax and my tricep will actually now be the one that contracts and pulls that lower arm back down. So now it becomes the prime mover. So the prime mover is, again, the term given to the muscle that's causing the movement. Synergists and antagonists, there are sometimes surrounding muscles that aid in the process of muscle movement. So hopefully you guys are familiar with synergists and antagonists when it comes to stories, that the synergist always works with the main character, the antagonist goes against the main character. Or even just the terms synergy and antagonism. Synergy means working with, antagonist means working against. So any surrounding muscles that are helping in this process, a synergist is one that works directly with the prime mover to help that movement happen, whereas an antagonist works against. So in that example, that's kind of what's happening here. A bicep is our prime mover, and any surrounding muscles that are helping that, contraction. Tricep is really working as an antagonist in that case, because it's working against that prime mover. So it's just, again, all really working to help that muscle movement take place, but that's what those different terms mean. And I do want you guys to be familiar with those. Any muscle overuse and underuse, sometimes you may see these specific terms. Hypertrophy, whenever you see hypertrophy, again, hyper means too much. So too much muscle is what's happening here. So this is growth in response to overuse, which is actually ideal for people who are bodybuilders, because this is the result that they're looking for. When they are overusing their muscles, constantly lifting weights, they're looking for hypertrophy to take place because they're trying to build up their muscle tissue. So that's never a bad thing. The only time hypertrophy is a bad thing would be the buildup of cardiac muscle. Sometimes in a disorder, cardiac hypertrophy is when the heart muscle grows too large, and that can cause a number of different issues. So that would be a bad example of hypertrophy. Atrophy, on the other hand, is the underuse of our muscles. And so this is considered a wasting away of muscles caused by a number of different things. Disuse atrophy just means we're not using them anymore. So when bodybuilders stop lifting weights, what's going to happen is those big muscles that they've developed, they're actually going to go back down. So disuse, or denervation, which just means there is some type of cause of it, the nerve signal that's being sent to that skeletal muscle is cut off somehow. There is sometimes caused by disorders, or may have been caused by an accident of some sort. For some reason, the nerve is not connecting to the muscle the correct way. So that would cause the weakening of that muscle. Or senile atrophy. Sometimes in old age, the misuse, or not misuse, but sometimes disuse takes place there for that. And it just, in old age, the weakening of the muscles happens. Another term, contracture, is an abnormal fibrous formation that causes the muscle to remain in a contracted, flexed position. So it's almost like it freezes in that position. Oftentimes we see this in sometimes stroke patients, or those who have different disorders, kind of a lot of different causes for that. But that contracture, we see a muscle remaining in a contract state. And that's what that means, that contracture. Okay. So this is where we kind of get into, that's kind of the extent that I want you guys to be familiar with our muscular chapter. So I'm just going to touch on some of these just because, just interesting terms and some things to be familiar with. If you guys want to stop here, you can, but the rest of the PowerPoint I did leave on here just because I think it's good to, sometimes be familiar with it. If that's sometimes something that comes up a little bit later in your all's program, you have this to reference, but I'm not going to test you on all of these. So these are some things you may actually be familiar with. How skeletal muscles are named is typically according to their shape. So size, so see that maximus or gluteus maximus is named because of the size. The shape, so the trapezoid is a type of shape, so the trapezius is shaped in a certain way. The orientation of the fiber, so the rectus abdominis is, how the fibers are together. Where it's located. The pectoralis is the pec muscles, so where it's located that way, or it's named that way. The number of origins, so the biceps, there's two origins when the biceps, are moving. So biceps, see that prefix bi there. The origin and the insertion, so the sternocleidomastoid, it's based on how it's attached to, the sternum and the mastoid. So it's just all kinds of different reasons for naming. And then muscle action, adductors, named according to the muscle action. They are more often times seen performing the action of adduction. So this picture just shows you guys some of those common muscles. There are over 600 skeletal muscles in the human body. So again, we could be here all day long, but this is a great reference chart should you guys need to come back to that later. And so the rest of the PowerPoint goes into naming of all the facial muscles. A lot of these should look pretty familiar to you because, again, of how they're named. Like here, we see the zygomaticus. Zygomaticus, again, obviously, our zygomatic bones are what we talked about when we talked about our facial bones. The frontalis, named very similar. Oculi, oftentimes, again, and avicularis oris, we're seeing eye movements taking place there. So just, again, some common things. And so you can see some of those muscles in just the face. These are particularly the ones that are involved in the process of chewing because of their attachment to our mandible, our lower jawbone. So the masseter and the temporalis are the muscles that are responsible. They attach directly to the mandible, responsible for the opening and closing of that mandible. Of the neck, the sternocleidomastoid, the trapezius, again, just some common ones. These are the muscles involved in breathing. So when we talk about respiration, we will definitely reference the diaphragm, and the intercostal muscles are the muscles that are between the ribs. So those are, that's just kind of a common term that we'll see. So we'll talk about that when we cover respiration too. Our, muscles of the abdomen, you'll see muscles of the shoulder girdle and the arm. So again, some similar terms we've already seen. Of the forearm, we've got, again, the terms we were just looking at a second ago with the biceps and the triceps. Wrist, hand, and fingers. We talked last lecture about carpal tunnel because we were talking about the carpals, our wrist bones. Muscles of the thigh, so some of these you might be pretty familiar with, and the muscles of the leg and the foot. So again, we could go on forever, and then this ends with just some certain special muscles for the involvement of certain activities that we may participate in. So again, like I said, muscle chapter, guys, just real short and sweet. Just be familiar with, again, the names of our muscle tissue, skeletal, smooth, and cardiac, and where we find those. Be familiar with those different terms we talked about with muscles: origin, insertion, synergist, prime mover, and our antagonist. Be familiar with fascia and, why can't I think for right now? Fascia and, what was the other term? Connective tissue term, and tendon. Anyway, so just those are kind of the main things to focus on. Know that, again, that a skeletal muscle is controlled by the somatic nerve division of our nervous system, and that it is our only voluntary muscle movement, and that is why, we have that control. We'll talk next week about nerves, but that's all I really want you guys to be familiar with. All right, guys, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to let me know.